May we pray. Oh God, once again we come in here and we ask that you open our hearts and our minds with your very presence. So as we contemplate the meaning of these scriptures, that we'll hear it with openness and joy. For we ask it in your Son's name. Amen. I used to have a watch on my left arm, and I was standing out in the parsonage yard a couple of days ago, and it just broke, and the band snapped, and the pieces, I could see the pieces go like this. So I carried the watch down to the little watchmaker fixture down here on 2 blocks away, and got a sad report back Friday. They said that Bulova no longer makes that watch band. So I don't have a watch this morning. But don't panic. The worship team put a digital clock right here on the pulpit. But it's not going to mean much today. So there's an old story about a Western Buddhist woman who was in India touring. And it was also an educational trip. She was there to learn about her faith. And she was riding with another woman in a rickshaw carriage when they entered this congested area, and a man jumped into the carriage with them and was trying to rob them. And there was a tussle that ensued, and the man accidentally fell out of the carriage and ran away. He didn't get anything, and he didn't hurt the 2 women. But they were shaken a lot, as you can imagine. Well, the Buddhist woman went back to her teacher, and she asked a very serious question. She said, what should I have done as a Buddhist? How should I have responded to that situation? And the teacher thought for a moment, and he said, you should have very mindfully and with great compassion whack that attacker over the head with your umbrella. Now, I tell that amusing story to point out the truth in what the teacher said. Compassion is a verb. It's an action word. Seeing something and going, "Ah," is not compassion. Seeing something and say, how terrible, it's not compassion. Seeing pain and suffering and then attempting to do something about it is genuine compassion. Compassion is comprised of 2 words, a Latin stem com, which means bring together. It's where we get the word communication, community, and even communion, where we and God join together through the Lord's meal. Passion, on the other hand, is a strong emotion. It's emotion so strong that there's suffering in it, that you actually suffer. So the idea is compassion. When you see someone who is in pain and suffering, you become one with that person to the degree that you suffer with that person. That's more than just empathy. Compassion is the sometimes fatal capacity for feeling what it's like to live in somebody else's skin, to understand and feel their circumstance, to understand and feel their situation. Or as the Native Americans used to say, how it feels to walk in someone else's moccasin. I like what Friedrich Buechner said about it. He said, compassion is the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy for me, until there's peace and joy finally for you. Compassion. It's a dynamic word. It's not static. It's a doing word. If you will, it's a verb. There was a 5-year-old child with his mother shopping in a grocery store, and the turmoil began just as soon as they entered the front door. He wanted this, he wanted that. He was climbing under the cart and in the cart, and things were just going bad. And she was getting more and more aggravated with her 5-year-old. And by the time they get to the checkout counter, there's all that stuff there. He sees the gum and all the little things that every child wants, and he wants this and that. And she finally, out of frustration, screams at him, "No!" And his lip pops out. And the cashier looks at the two and says, "May I help you?" And before the mother could say one word, he said, "Yes. I want my daddy." Now, that little fellow may have been the very source of his misery, as most of us are inclined to be. Just wanted someone who could connect with him. And at that moment, the one he thought could connect with him the best was Daddy. That sounds to me a lot like humanity. Humanity wants relationships and we don't get them. We want someone to understand us and we don't get that. We want someone who really understands our hopes and our dreams, our wants and our desires and our frustrations and our hurts and, yes, even our fears. And sometimes we don't get that. We want someone who will understand our faults and our failures and to tell us that they're not fatal faults and failures, that there's still life ahead of the failures and faults. And sometimes we don't get that. And so we're left with Daddy. We're left with Daddy, the holy. We yearn for that eternal relationship to fill in the gaps of the physical. In our gospel text this morning, people came to Jesus for that very same reason. They needed someone who cared. They needed someone who understood them. They needed someone who would understand them without judgment. They needed someone who could show them some compassion. So when they heard about this Jesus, they ran wherever he went. He got in a boat. They ran around the water line and met him on the other side. When they heard he was coming, they went in the towns and villages and they found every sick person they could find to bring to him so that they could be healed. They wanted what that little boy wanted. They wanted some compassion. They wanted some understanding. Tony Campolo tells in his book, Who Switched the Price Tags? I read it many years ago, but there was a story in the book that I still remembered, and I'd like to share it with you this morning. It's about Miss Thompson and Teddy Stollard. Miss Thompson was a school teacher, 4th grade, and Teddy was one of the students in her grade. And Teddy was kind of an outling. He never got involved. He stood on the edges of everything. He never talked. The children made fun of him. They ridiculed him. And on the playground, he was always in the grass, sitting in the shade, watching everybody else play. And one Christmas, in the 3rd grade, Teddy's mother died. And the connection with the school almost died with her. And so in the 4th grade, at Christmas time, when all the children came to Miss Thompson's desk and put their shiny gifts on it, everybody was really proud. They had the nice bows and the wrapping paper and the cards. Everything was just really beautiful. And then Teddy walks in and puts his gift in the center of the desk, and it's a little brown bag. And Miss Thompson realizes the situation. She understands the circumstance. All the kids kind of chuckle at Teddy's gift. And instead of saying something or maligning it or pushing it to the side or ignoring it, she instead opened it right there. And it was a half-filled bottle of perfume. And it was a damaged bracelet. And he said, "This was my mother's. I thought it would smell good and look good on you. And she made over it. Oh, what wonderful perfume. It smells so great. And the bracelet, and she puts the bracelet on. And this bracelet is the best bracelet I've ever had. Teddy, I just want to thank you for the most marvelous gift you could have given me at Christmas. And he said, Miss Thompson, you smell just like my mommy. She went home that night and she cried in her prayer. And she said, Lord, teach me not just to be a teacher. Teach me to be compassionate and to understand my students so I can touch their souls too. Well, a few years passed. She didn't hear much from Teddy as he moved on up the educational ladder. But she received a letter and it said, Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know I'll be graduating second in my class. Love, Teddy Stoddard. 4 years later, she got another note. Miss Thompson, they just told me I'll be graduating first in my class. I wanted you to be the first to know. The university has not been that easy, but I liked it. Love, Teddy Stoddard. And 4 years later, she received another letter. Dear Miss Thompson, as of today, I am Theodore Stoddard, MD. How about that? I wanted you to be the first to know. I'm getting married next month. I want you to come and sit where my mother would sit if she were alive. You're the only family I have now. Dad died last year. Love, Teddy Stoddard. Miss Thompson went to the wedding and sat where Teddy's mother would have sat because she let God use her as an instrument of compassion and understanding. I think Jesus would say to us, you know, his children called by his name, Christian, to sit where he would sit if he were with us in a physical sense. I think he would say to go and be where he would go and be in his presence, as his presence. I think the reason Jesus attracted so many people was because everything he did had compassion at its heart. Look at his teachings. At the bottom of the teaching is compassion. Look at the relationships. At the bottom of the relationship, there's always compassion. Look at the healing. Look at the teaching. Look at the preaching. Look at everything he did. There's always compassion at the bottom of it all. There's a story that comes to us from Northern Virginia a couple hundred years ago. And there was an elderly fellow sitting beside a stream, and it was iced over much, ice on the edges. And it was too deep for him to walk across and much too cold for him to get to the other side without freezing. So he sat there on the side of the bank waiting for someone to stop and share a ride with him. And when a rider would come up, he would look and he would put his head back down and not say anything. Well, there was a group of riders approached him late afternoon, early evening. And there's 5 riders, and he looks up and sees the first 4, and he just puts his head back down. And finally, the last rider gets to him, and he finally looks up and says something. He says, would you mind giving a poor, cold fellow a ride across the stream? And the rider said, sure. Took him by the hand and pulled him up on the back of the horse, and across the stream they went. And then the rider gets into the other side and says, why did you let all those other riders, those first 4 riders, pass by without saying anything? And then when I get there, you ask me for a ride. And he said, I could see ahead and noticed you wait to ask me. And last rider in the group for a ride. Why would you do that? What if I hadn't stopped and taken you? You would have been there on the bank all night and probably have died. And he said, I prayed about it, and I could look ahead and I could see those riders, and I could see no compassion in their face, no concern whatsoever in their face. And so when they came, I never bothered to ask them for a ride. But when you got here, I saw compassion in your eyes. So I ask you. And the writer said, well, I pray I'll never be so consumed in in my own affairs, that I fail to respond to the needs of somebody else with kindness and compassion. And with that, Thomas Jefferson turned his horse back towards the White House, the President of the United States. When he looked into the eyes of the President, he saw compassion. And when those people of Palestine looked into the eyes of Jesus, they saw understanding. They saw compassion. It drew them to him. They saw interest in them. They saw understanding, and they came to him from everywhere just to look in those eyes, just to be connected. And I imagine it was from the shadow of the doorway of his home in Nazareth as a child. He became sensitized to it. Not desensitized, he became sensitized to it. He stood in that doorway as a child, and he watched the broken. He watched the outcast. He watched the shut out. He watched the maimed and the powerless. He watched those that Judaism had rejected pass by. He also saw the rich and the powerful, the manipulators, those who always get ahead. He watched them pass by, and all that prepared him for the ministry and mission that God gave him. Jesus then passed that compassion on to his disciples. And the disciples passed that call to compassion on to the church. Thus we are called, those of us who comprise the church today, to be compassionate as the Father was compassionate with all of his children. But sometimes compassion is the last thing we'll give. Then when we do, it's begrudged, or we're afraid of being used and we're reluctant. We don't want to be duped. There are ministries and missions, there's agencies and governmental places for people to go, so we look away from the needs around us. And I'm reminded of something my grandfather said one time. He said, the worst form of a sinner is the self-righteous person who forgets his own sin. And I think Harvey was right. One of my favorite Southern writers was Flannery O'Connor. She was Roman Catholic, and she had a caustic eye about things that were not genuine or things that were deceitful and counterfeit. And of course, her discoveries found their way into her short stories in the forms of characters. And in one, she wrote an article about a short story that she titled Good Country People. And in that article, she wrote, "You will have found Christ when you are concerned with other people's sufferings and not your own." Very simple. It's in finding the other people that we find Christ. See, it's not enough to simply see the suffering of others and point it out and say, oh, look how bad that is. Oh, look how terrible that is. It's not enough to just sympathize with it. Jesus called his followers to empathize, to be compassionate, to join together with those who are suffering. In March 1993, Kevin Carter made a trip to the Sudan near the village of Ed. And Carter found a girl who had stopped on her way to a feeding station being run by the UN. The picture's right here. I hope you look at it before you leave today. Please don't take it. It's the only one I got. But I want you to look at that picture, please. And he took a picture of this little girl, and just as she put her face in the dirt, folded her knees under in a fetal position, and put her face in the dirt, a vulture landed right behind her. The vulture's in the picture. Landed right behind her. And Carter moved himself around for 20 minutes trying to get the exact angle to take that picture. And finally he took it. And the buzzard's not moving, and the child's not moving. Now, he turned that in to the New York Times, and the New York Times published that, and 3 months later he won the Pulitzer Prize for that photograph. But he also receive worldwide condemnation for taking the photo and not doing anything about it. But when in fact after the photo was taken, he took the child to the feeding station. He never told that, but that's what happened. About 2 years after that, he committed suicide. Carbon monoxide poisoning. And he wrote a note, and in that note he said, "I am haunted by the vivid memories of killings and corpses, and anger and pain, of starving or of wounded children, or trigger-happy madmen of killer executioners." Now see, he was committed to the ethic of a photographer that you don't become a part of your story. You take the picture, but you never become part of the story. He stuck to that ethic, and it haunted him. It haunted him. He saw so much misery and pain, but he couldn't show compassion on it because of his ethic of non-involvement. And I've thought about that many times, and I think there are many in this world living lives as though they're photographers with a photographer's ethic. They'll watch, they see, they point, they shrug, they say, "Oh," but they don't do anything. They do absolutely nothing. There are many in this world who would call themselves Christian, who are taking pictures with high-definition, high-colored cameras and putting those photos in their album and doing little about what they see in the photograph. You know, as I read the New Testament, it's about as impossible for a person to call themselves a Christian and be non-involved as a person, a couch potato, who sits there and plays football video games and calling themselves an athlete. They don't compute. They don't go together. We're just not called to chase away vultures. We're called to do something about it, to make a difference, to transform, to engage the misery that we see before us. One last thing. In the 30s, a young traveler was exploring the French Alps, and he came upon a vast stretch of barren land. It was desolate, it was forbidding, it was ugly. It was the kind of place you ran from quickly. You didn't want to be there long periods of time. Then suddenly this young traveler stopped dead in his tracks. In the middle of this vast wasteland was a bent-over old man. And on his back he had a sack of acorns, like Johnny Appleseed. In his hand was a 4-foot-long piece of pipe. And he would go along about every 20 feet, and he would drive that iron pipe into the ground, and he'd drop an acorn, and he'd step on it. And he'd go on for the next 20 feet, and he'd drive the iron pipe into the ground. And the old traveler said, "I've planted over 100,000 acorns. Perhaps only maybe a tenth of them will grow." It seems that the fellow's wife had died and his 2 children had died, and he wanted to make a difference. He wanted to do something significant. He wanted to bless somebody's life, do something for someone that would change them. So he's planting acorns. And 25 years later, the now not so young traveler, he returned to that same barren wasteland to discover a forest 2 miles wide and 5 miles long, because a man was planting acorns 25 years earlier. I pray that's who we are. I do. I pray that's who we are. Those with compassion, punching holes in the pain, punching holes in the hopelessness, in the suffering, and planting something there that's going to grow. Planting something there that's going to bless. I hope that following generations, 25, maybe 50 years from now, will see pictures where we engage the suffering and the pain around us here at First Church. And I hope in those photos, from those photos, they'll be able to say, look, the members of First United Methodist Church of Myrtle Beach saw a great mass of hurting people, and they had genuine compassion on them. Compassion is an action word. It's a verb. Amen.